I want to dig into that last issue a bit more here with somebody who's a renowned expert here on nuclear security and nonproliferation issues. That is the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Corey Hinderstein, who joins us now. Corey, let me ask you first of all just about the moment that we're in, and Jeff was alluding to it, the way that this could be kind of transformative to the Saudi economy, but a lot of questions about why this is indeed happening now. How are you processing this conversation that's taking place about the White House's willingness to help facilitate this in Saudi Arabia, and indeed what it could mean for, yes, the Middle East, but the world more broadly?
Thank you for having me this morning. This is a really interesting question because the Saudis have been pursuing nuclear energy for years. It comes from a couple of different approaches. One, they have some uranium deposits, although they may prove to be maybe less fruitful than they had hoped at one point. Any energy that they use domestically could free up oil that they could sell internationally, and the economics of that may be good. They're also probably interested in creating options for nuclear weapons in the future. It doesn't mean that they've made a decision to build a nuclear weapon, but Saudi leaders at multiple levels have said that they want the possibility to pursue a nuclear weapon if, for example, Iran was to acquire one.
That seems like the key issue, because Saudi, again, not hurting for energy, and also if they really wanted a civilian nuclear program, they could have had one years ago. They've put out bids. My understanding is previously they've talked to China, Russia. They've investigated this before. Is there a reasonable non-military explanation for not making the same fuel restrictions on the Saudi deal that the U.S. did when it made its deal with the UAE in 2009?
Well, obviously, geopolitics are playing here. The United States wants to be Saudi's nuclear partner, as opposed to China or Russia. And in order to do that, we have historically asked for constraints on those programs that China and Russia don't ask for. So the real question here is, which is more important, that the U.S. industry and strategic partnership be engaged with Saudi and at the expense of Russia and China, or that we hold to some of these core non-proliferation principles. Now, I come from the non-proliferation community. Of course, I'm really committed to these non-proliferation principles. But there are some interesting creative ways that previous administrations, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and the current Trump administration have looked at to say, are there ways we can get what we want and also give a little bit? And on the domestic enrichment, the issue that you've noted, what they seem to have said is, we will engage in a conversation about it, so we don't cut it off. But there has to be a later decision point, so there's a gate that has to go through related to economics. And then if we pass that gate, then yes, potentially there would be enrichment in Saudi Arabia, but it would be U.S. technology under U.S. control in some sort of black box arrangement. That's creative. I don't know if it can really happen, but I think it's kind of better than the alternative of opening the space for Russia and China, and certainly better than Saudi Arabia getting fed up and just pursuing a domestic program themselves.
That's interesting.
Corey, let me lean into a chain reaction metaphor here, obviously so integral to nuclear energy, but also when it comes to policies surrounding it. And our colleague Mark Champion, who covers foreign affairs for Bloomberg Opinion, wrote a column about this, and he said, this is a problem that's been kind of solving a tactical problem here, but could really spread more widely. He said, if the U.S. is allowed to bend nuclear non-proliferation rules for Saudi Arabia, then why not for Egypt, Turkey, South Korea, or Japan? And if that's okay for U.S. allies, then why not for Russian and Chinese ones also? Talk a bit about that, the way that we're seeing this play out here in somewhat of a vacuum, but the way that you're thinking through what a carve-out like this, an exception like this, going down this path might mean for non-proliferation more broadly.
It's a really important question, and I think one that's loaded with a lot of misunderstandings about history. For example, we do talk about the gold standard in the context of the United Arab Emirates and what they have agreed to and what they've accepted as far as constraints on their program. But those were not imposed on the UAE. Those were initiated by the UAE. And what we've seen is Japan does have a different rule than Korea, and that creates problems in the relationships with our East Asian allies. We do have different rules with different countries. We do have a case-by-case basis. Now, there are certain foundational elements that we seek, but for example, we have not required the no enrichment and no reprocessing commitment from other countries, even since the UAE agreed to it. It's ideal. But sometimes we're not living in a perfect world, and when we're thinking about the relationship that nuclear energy can create, a multi-generational, multi-decadal, ongoing engagement with the United States, sometimes that leverage may be worth more than some other things that we have to give up.
I also wonder, when you look at, let's say, who started Iran's nuclear program, the phrase atoms for peace comes to mind. If there's enough consideration about, yes, this administration, this regime in Saudi is nominally friendly towards the United States, but that doesn't mean what comes down the line in 5-10 years is going to be. And it seems to me the U.S. fails to learn this lesson time and time again. We arm the Mujahideen, that goes to the, goes into the Taliban. The weapons that we left with the Shah went against us, in Iran. Is there a fear that should this regime change and no longer be friendly to the United States, they would have armed a country that could be an antagonist to America?
This is a really important point. I mean, these systems, these facilities, a nuclear power plant, a uranium enrichment plant, if one day they were to pursue that down the road, these are not things that can just be turned off. But there are things that we could do to constrain capability, but it's not a guarantee. And you're right that we haven't learned that lesson in all cases. There's another area where we may be repeating the problems of the past, and that's with our own civil nuclear program and how we're seeing about pursuing that going forward and looking at the use of some materials, including plutonium, that could have this dual use, being possible fuel for nuclear energy and fuel for a nuclear weapon. In the past, we spread highly enriched uranium all over the world because we thought these research reactors fueled by HEU were great, collaborative projects. And then we've spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars collecting that HEU back to the United States. I don't want us to see us doing the same thing with plutonium.
Let's end here with the announcement the president made yesterday, this event that he had in the Oval Office, the announcement that there's going to be more kind of civilian nuclear power efforts here in the U.S. They're going to be happening kind of pioneered by or prompted by the private sector here. How do you greet that? It does seem like there increasingly is a conversation in this country that there's inevitability to there being more nuclear energy in the U.S. A good thing as you see it, not to be too blunt in my questioning, but are we at a point at which it does seem like this is a path that the U.S. has to go down in light of the demands that we're seeing placed on the energy grid?
In my personal opinion, I think that nuclear energy and the expansion of civil nuclear energy is actually a good thing, especially domestically. But there are ways to do it right, and there are ways to do it wrong. And exactly in the point we were just talking, let's learn our lessons. Let's think about the proliferation sensitivity of the materials we put into that ecosystem and into that supply chain. Let's think about the verification and monitoring that we can help the International Atomic Energy Agency build so that we have warning if things were to go into a non-civilian pathway. And let's use civil nuclear energy as both a partnership point and a pursuit of clean energy, lower carbon future, and energy security.